Hi, I'm John MacMillan, Head of Building Consultancy here at Fairhurst, Buckley. Today I'm going to talk to you about dilapidations and how things generally pan out at the end of a lease. First of all, I'm going to talk about the three principal ways in which a dilapidations claim can be dealt with. Whilst our perceptions and opinions may vary, anyone who has either owned or leased commercial property is likely to have experienced dealing with dilapidations. From a landlord or building owner's perspective, they often find themselves frustrated that tenants have failed to look after their asset. From a tenant's perspective, there's often a feeling that landlords have used dilapidations as a way of punishing them and extracting a sum of money as they leave the building. Whichever side of the fence you're on, if not handled well, the whole dilapidations process can become somewhat of a merry dance. Typically, there are three principal ways in which dilapidations can be dealt with at lease end. The first is that the tenant carries out the works and yields up the property in repair. The second option is that a horse trade or a cash settlement is agreed between the parties. The third option is that the landlord undertakes the works following lease expiry. The alternative, as quite often happens, is that things are dealt with by a combination of the above. So the first scenario is one whereby the tenant undertakes all of the works prior to exiting the building. So as you can see from the slide, there's various pros and cons to the tenant carrying out the works. The pros, generally the tenant can drive the process and control costs. From a landlord's perspective, it means that the premises are ready to let immediately after lease end. The last thing that a landlord wants is a void property. It also means that good relations can be retained. We often advise clients who may have several buildings with the same landlord, or maybe moving from one property to another with the same landlord. So it's always good if relations can be retained in such circumstances. The negatives to the tenant doing the works, obviously from a tenant's perspective, it means that the tenant can't occupy right up to the end of the lease. They need to be able to come out early in order to give themselves time with the building being empty in order to procure and carry out the works. And perhaps the most common downside of a tenant carrying out the works is that we can still find ourselves in a situation where we're in dispute over the standard and quality of workmanship. This happens quite a lot with redecoration, whereby a tenant will carry out their obligation to redecorate before vacating a building, but the landlord will claim that the works are substandard and they'll incur further costs redecorating following the lease expiry, so the tenant ends up paying twice. So the second scenario is a cash settlement, sometimes known as a horse deal. The benefits of this, it means the tenant can remain in occupation right up to the lease end, so they can carry on with their looking after their own business, not having to worry about coming out early in order to carry out any works. It can provide a quick resolution if both parties are amenable to a deal, and as a consequence of that, professional fees, legal fees and surveyors fees can be kept to a minimum. It also helps to avoid a scenario whereby the tenant carries out costs in relation to works which may later become superseded or valued or rendered valueless by the landlord's future actions. In other words, abortive costs. It also means that this alternative measure of loss can be brought in, so settlements can be based upon diminution and reversionary value rather than the cost of repair. It enables the tenant to be released for more future obligations, and it provides the landlord with flexibility of cash so he can do what he wants. Assuming that the cash settlement is properly documented, the landlord's free to do whatever he wishes with the money. The negatives to that is that you can end up paying, from a tenant's perspective, you can end up paying a settlement level above what the landlord's ever going to spend on the building. So essentially the landlord can end up with a cash windfall if he relets the building on the same terms without doing any works. Another negative towards a cash deal is that sometimes negotiations between surveyors can become protracted. I mean, personally, I've got a couple on the go that have been going on for 4 or 5 years. And another negative from a landlord's perspective is that if a deal's done and a cash settlement's paid but the landlord doesn't actually do the works, then over time his asset's going to gradually deteriorate. So the final scenario is one whereby the tenant hasn't done the works, a cash deal hasn't been agreed, so the landlord opts to procure the works following the expiry of the lease. The major benefit to that from a landlord's perspective is that in carrying out the works and incurring the costs, he's got prima facie evidence of the loss incurred. In simple terms, if a landlord does those works which the tenant should have done, then they should be well placed to recover the costs as damages. Again, from a landlord's perspective, it enables them to control the quality of works and ensure that the condition of their asset remains high. From a tenant's perspective, on the opposite side of that, it means that the landlord is in some ways forced to prove loss. So if the tenant haven't spent any money before the lease ends and they haven't agreed to pay a sum of money over to the landlord, the onus is very much on the landlord to actually prove that they're going to suffer a loss. And the negatives to a landlord procuring the works, the biggest one from a landlord's perspective is that they need to put their hand in the pocket and spend the money before they can recover it, which isn't always easy, particularly for smaller property owners. The major downfall from a tenant's perspective in allowing the landlord to procure the works, or in the scenario whereby the landlord procure the works after the lease, it just means that they've got limited options available. Essentially, they had their chance to do the works, they didn't do that, they've not managed to agree a cash deal, so the landlord holds all the cards. So we'll just wrap things up with a few key points to take away from today. As we've seen, there are many variable factors to consider, no one size strategy fits all. You've got to remember that landlords have a long-term interest, wishing to maximise a claim and protect their asset, whereas tenants generally have a small, shorter-term interest, wishing to minimise a claim and reduce exit costs. It's important that we remember that damages are there to compensate for the landlord for loss incurred rather than to punish a tenant. Dilapidations doesn't necessarily have to be about winning or losing, but ultimately it's our experience that the party who drives the process and acts the most proactively will be best placed to achieve their desired outcome. To have maximum impact and help you achieve your desired outcome, it makes great sense to get us involved as early in the process as possible. Thanks for watching. I hope you've taken something from the video. If I can be of any further assistance, my details are on the screen.